education is about connection. It's about networking. It's about being together. It's about thinking further in future. So Richard, maybe in the coming 5 minutes, if you can tell us about what has technology changed in the education world, how do you think technology can really effectively help inclusion, real meaningful inclusion in the classroom?
Mike was the student, actually, who was studying to be a pig farmer. And I met up with Mike, would you believe, last year. And we had this very conversation about how life had changed so much. And there was Mike. He now runs his own farm just north of London. He keeps pigs and sheep and ponies and all sorts of things on this farm. And he does all his kind of calculations about the feed that he gives the animals, and he does his accounts and things on a little device that sits in his pocket, his smartphone. That smartphone is their way for accessing materials. I remember, I will never forget an occasion when my son, who has dyslexia, we were on holiday in Vietnam, and he got his exam results, very important exam results, and they were really bad. He'd worked so hard, and just the exam environment was not a place for him to thrive, and he found this kind of shocking. And as we were driving out the jungle, he'd had a day or two to process it, and he was on his phone, and I was kind of trying not to get angry. We're going through this amazing scenery, and he's on his phone, and then I realized he was reading. He never read a book. He'd studied hard, but he would never read a book and develop his vocabulary and his understanding of the world and so on. And he was reading a book on his phone because he was able to make the text bigger, to choose a font that worked for him, to change the colors, to make the line length short. This is what worked for his reading difference, his reading disability. And so the smartphone is something that has changed enormously. And to take it to the classroom, Yeti, that you asked me to, I've been speaking with some students in America who are in university, and their experience last year for getting access to the textbooks they needed for their degree and master's courses was, they got the names of the books they needed, they went to the university bookstore, they bought the print book, they took the receipt to the disability service office, and they would then use that receipt as evidence to then get some kind of version of that file, maybe from the publisher, and then the process would begin to make that textbook accessible for them. You know what's different this year is those same students would be told what the book is that need to read. They would go to the regular ebook store that their classmates are all using. They would get hold of that book. They would be able to see before they buy the book what the accessibility properties were of the book. Does the book contain image descriptions, page navigation, accessible mathematics, extended descriptions, accessible chemistry, and so on? If they like, and the ability to maybe reflow the text, whatever it is that they need as their own kind of requirements. And then if it looks good, then they can download that book, and they're reading that book in the same app, from the same store, at the same time as their friends who are also in their class. And they're saying, I don't need to go to the disability office anymore. I'm included and I've got access to this title. What an amazing difference. What a change from when I told you I had to type in the pages of Mike's textbook to that student getting rich descriptions done by subject matter experts that describe whether you're studying psychology or geography or ancient Egypt or whatever. A subject matter expert has described the photographs and the images, and then everyone gets it. And you know what? Folk who maybe use read aloud, who are not blind, but maybe they just learn differently, would like to listen to the book talking to them. They get the image descriptions too. It's all about learning, and suddenly they're making more of these photographs and images that are in the book. So this is just amazing progress, and it's very real. I'm not painting you a fantasy. This is what's happening now, and indeed in 2 years' time, in the European Union, the largest economic area in the world, it will be illegal to sell ebooks that are not accessible. So this is a huge revolution in access to reading and publishing, which impacts on education. You asked me what then still needs to change. So I'll tell you the story of Naveen, who my colleague Dipendra met in February. So Dipendra lives in India. He works in the DAISY team, and we're used to going and talking in schools and to educators about this wonderful world of accessible books. But Dipendra went a bit further afield. He went to a small school that's in a jungle area, and he met students who were blind. And he started talking to them and saying, what are your names and how do you spell your name? We don't know how to spell our name. Okay, well, let's talk about the books you enjoy reading. Well, yes, when I have a book read to me, their experience always was with an adult who would read the book to them. So they had to find an adult who could read, who had the time to read, and would then read them for as long as the adult was able to. At the age of 13, Naveen had never independently read a book. And so through the technology that we are developing, it's now possible for a student like Naveen to have a very low-cost device, and he is able to independently read. So these two stories tell us two very ends of the spectrum. One is where access is available, it comes as standard, it's what we call born accessible. When books are born digital, they're born accessible. And these students are not, I wouldn't say fortunate, they have the right to have access to that content, especially if they're paying for it. And then we have so many people, and as we've heard in other sessions, most of the people with print disabilities in the world live in low-income regions, and they don't have access even to the most basic books. So that is a huge challenge to be resolved.
These are really great and so powerful stories to tell the world how accessible technology can really transform our learning outcomes. Now, I think we should go beyond the minimum, right? Now, it's not only about access. We talk about outcomes. The outcome, the impact is key. So definitely I'll come back to you, Richard. Renita, thank you for joining us. How can teachers and educators be trained and supported to effectively utilize accessible technology in the classrooms? How can we empower teachers to really be able to use these accessible technologies in the classrooms? And what role can policymakers and educational institutions play in promoting the adoption of accessible technologies?
I'll give an example of one of the programs that we're running in Uganda. We're supporting a partner called Cyber School Technology Solutions to implement an e-learning program. And so that program started in the middle of COVID, of the pandemic. In Uganda, imagine we were locked down for 2 years, and so people couldn't go to school for 2 years. And what that meant was that for those schools that had the capability to, all the learning was now being done online. And what we did see, so of course there are not very many of those, and what we did see was that for schools and education institutions that hadn't started their journey to e-learning, what they did was that the teachers, the lecturers just got their normal notes, they scanned them onto PDF, and then they were just, sort of getting online or to maybe using Zoom or Google Meet and just reading those notes out. And so, of course, that was not a very good learning experience for students. But more importantly, for those schools that had students with disabilities, many of them were excluded from all of that. So when we got contacted by this partner to do something about that, we worked together, we're still working together to see how to teach these instructors how to teach online, but also ensure that we don't leave young students with disabilities behind. And so it's very important to ensure that really at the onset, when the curriculum is being designed, it's designed in an inclusive manner so that it's not an afterthought to make sure that every student can access that educational material. So instructors or educators need to make sure that they're inclusive with the materials that they use, and they must make sure that all their students, so they need to know their students, They need to make sure that whatever material they're using can be accessed with the different assistive technologies that are available. So of course, that means that we must invest a lot in educating these instructors, but also supporting the parents and the guardians of these young people, because they make themselves not be aware, first and foremost, about what disabilities their children or their students have, or the level, the degree of the impairment. So being able to assess easily what the impairment of the student is, or of the child is very important. Also, I think we've heard from several panelists telling us that unfortunately people living with disabilities always are more negatively impacted, so they end up being more economically challenged. So being able to even just assess a disability in many places, like where I come from, I'm from Uganda, you would need to go to a certified medical practitioner or a specialist even. And so all of that is quite expensive. It costs a lot of money. So there are some technologies that you can use to easily, even if you're not a qualified medical professional, you can use those to assess the level of disability. So of course, it's not enough to just assess. Then we're talking about being able to educate these teachers, these instructors, so put them in professional networks, organize peer programs, exchange programs where they can learn from each other. There are some that are more advanced, teaching the less advanced. We could also have mentorship programs, and very important as well is to ensure that when you're teaching these educators, make sure that even this material is available online, so that there are libraries, examples, or videos teaching instructors how to even, apart from knowing themselves how to use assistive technology, but also sometimes being able to do some very basic diagnosis if something is not working well with these assistive technology tools. I could go on and on, but I think that's a good sort of start. I think you also talked about ensuring that we talked about, going online means that you've got to have an internet connection. So one of the challenges that we, of course, saw during COVID was that we were telling institutions to start teaching online, but many of the students didn't have access to that, to the internet itself. And so we did see in several countries, in Uganda as well, in particular, that you talked about the telcos. So these telco operators came to the rescue, and they zero-rated educational websites. So all education institutions that were licensed in the country could apply and have their material online. Now, at that time, that was more of a corporate social responsibility sort of thing. What we're trying to do, even at the foundation, we haven't cracked that yet, but what we're trying to do is to ensure that it doesn't just stop at just a corporate social responsibility, but make sure that we embed all of this in a sustainable manner, because we must make sure that we don't leave people behind, don't leave young people with disabilities, because then we already have a big digital divide. And again, I will not repeat what has been said. If we don't ensure that we include these young people from right now, we are going to create an even more unsustainable model.
Thank you so much, Renita. I think this was so powerful, right? Then I love the corporate social responsibility initial, but how do we sustain it is another important. I want to hear from both of you, Renita and Richard. How do you think accessible technology can help beyond our children with disabilities? Show me, give me an example. That way we can sell this idea. Accessible technologies can enhance the foundational literacy, numeracy of our children in Africa. How can we tell, or how can we justify that inclusion is not about the 10% children with disabilities we have globally? That's the figure from UNICEF. We have 10% of the children we have having a disability, 240 million. How can we show that this accessible technology can benefit more than those who have disabilities.
I remember really clearly a project that we did when I was working at the Royal National Institute of Blind People in the UK, when it wasn't even called the internet then, it was called the Information Superhighway. Does anyone remember that? So there was and we thought, this probably could be really important for kids with visual impairment and blindness in school. So we ran a project where we supported students with blindness and low vision to learn how to use the internet. And so far so boring, right? I mean, yeah, that sounds obvious. One of our key findings was that those students, their confidence went right up because of the esteem in which they were held by their non-disabled peers. They became like leaders, they could find things out, they knew how to do stuff, and suddenly they were showing how they had these abilities. They had disabilities, but they had abilities that the non-disabled students had. And this really helped them in terms of their confidence, their integration, their inclusion, how they were perceived by the teachers, and so on. Because one of the things that hold kids with disabilities back are the low expectations of the adults, isn't it? And yet they were seeing these learners with skills that they didn't have, that were using this amazing thing called the internet. Technology is a great enabler, it's a great leveler, and it can do even more than being a leveler. It can lift children with disabilities up higher so that they have that esteem from their peers and from their teachers and from their family. So here's an example of how it's not about just the 10%.
I think I will talk about my personal experience, I think, yeah? And it's perhaps not so much the assistive technologies, but why it's important to include how the rest can benefit by including us, people who live with disabilities. And so I must say I was modestly speaking, an A student when I was in my secondary, in my primary school and my secondary school. And so then I didn't do so well, though, when I was doing my final exam to get into university. So I had all these hopes, and I wanted to go and study engineering at the university, and it was extremely competitive. And so I didn't get in, and I couldn't believe it. But while I was waiting for the term to start, a friend of mine came to me and said, Renita, the government has this program that allows students with disabilities to get into, if they've made the pass mark to enter university, to get into the courses that they would like to do. And so, my mom was really excited, and she was like, oh, you've got to apply for this thing, you've got to do it. But I, on the other hand, I was ashamed, I was embarrassed, and I'd spent all this time trying to show that, even if I have a disability, I'm just as good as everybody else. I am even better. And then here I was using my disability to get into electrical engineering. So I said no for a really long time. And then after a while, I think my mom gave it another attempt, and she told me, what do these people who are getting into electrical engineering, what do they have over you? What is it? And so I said, well, they clearly have the brains to get into electrical engineering, which I don't have. And so my parents, they're Catholic. And so my mom said to me, where did they get those brains from? So I'm like, well, God gave them those brains. And then she said to me, where did your disability come from? Who gave it to you? And so I thought about that, and I said, I guess God gave me this disability. And then she said, well, see, so that's what God gave you to get into engineering. And that in itself helped me. Like, I then could deal, I am still a bit embarrassed, but, I took the course, I got in, I did electrical engineering. But getting to your point, I got a job right after I got a job with MTN. I've been a taxpayer in my country. I contribute to the economy. I pay taxes. I employ people in my home because through my education I got a job. I employ others. And so I think for me, the message is that, no matter what is going on with you, or if you're with someone who has a disability, it doesn't mean that they can't live a meaningful life, and that life can help you. I support other people in my village to pay for school fees for these people. So I think that if I had not, well, perhaps that I'm good in a job, I don't know, but I do something that I love, I feel fulfilled, and in that way, I'm contributing to building a society.
I think moms need to be celebrated everywhere. I'm not discriminating fathers, and in UNICEF, we believe that each parent has a role, indispensable role in upbringing children. So the universal design for learning is a principle that we need to follow. And inclusive education is definitely the foundation for inclusive Africa. If we really want to promote on that, we really need to invest in the skills of our teachers. We really need to invest in more innovations and bringing in actors like DAISY Consortium to ensure that accessibility is not about some group in education, rather it's about all learners. One correction, the 10% figure I gave you didn't have a disability comparison. It's just for children in sub-Saharan Africa, and we didn't know how many of them had or didn't have disability. So that also calls on for more data and research about the foundational numeracy and literacy skills of our learners with disabilities in this region. I understand our work, our networking, and our innovation will definitely contribute towards creating inclusive Africa, and inclusive education is the foundation.